Welcome to Didactic CAPS Board Study Edition. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed myself to help myself and other CAPS fellows study for their boards. But anyone interested in human development and mental health will also likely get something out of it. For a rundown on how it is produced, please see episode 1. I am using AI to assist me on many of the episodes. However, all of the content in the podcast should be considered to be my opinion and no one else's. It's also not medical advice. I cannot guarantee to CAPS fellows that it will actually help them on the boards, so there's that. This episode is a review of the basic developmental milestones children are expected to reach by age 5. Now, much of what I'm reporting here can be found at cdc.gov, and I'll put a link in the description. But again, they did not approve this content. People generally don't start counting milestones until about age 2 months. But it is worth noting that at birth, a human child should be able to do a few basic things. These include things like suckling, urination, defecation, crying, withdrawing from pain, and sleeping. A lot of sleeping. Now, if you're a lucky parent, then your newbie will sleep about 19 hours per day, but those unlucky parents are looking at about 14 hours. But today is not about sleep specifically. So let's jump ahead and start looking at what we can expect human flesh bags to be able to accomplish by the time they are 8 weeks old. There are different dimensions that I'm going to discuss today. Those include like the social and emotional milestones, language and communication milestones, their cognitive milestones, like how they learn, how they think, what they kind of do to solve problems, and then what they're able to do with their body, their movement or physical developmental milestones. So by age 2 months, kiddos should reach the point where they can be calmed down more easily when they're spoken to or picked up, especially by someone who is familiar to them. So they've started to recognize familiar voices and faces. In fact, this is where they start that social smile. When a familiar person talks to them or smiles at them, they'll be likely to smile back. As far as communication is concerned, by about 8 weeks, they're starting to make sounds other than just crying, kind of like the gurgling sounds. And they're reacting to loud sounds around them too. So sometimes really young infants, they just seem like oblivious to all the sounds going on around them. But by age 2 months, these sounds are going to, especially loud sounds, will start obviously disturbing them. Cognitively, now they're kind of just absorbing lots of things. They're watching you move. They're watching you do things. They'll look at stuff that you offer them for a few seconds. It'll kind of hold their attention a little bit longer, but they won't necessarily be able to do anything with it. But new things will especially draw their attention. So anything they see that's new, any unfamiliar sound is going to make them look toward it. Physically, by this point, they should be holding their head up pretty well on their tummy. They should be moving all 4 limbs pretty well, too. They're not necessarily able to hold themselves up, although some kids somehow manage. And they're not very dexterous. They can open their hand briefly. They might grasp something that you put in it, but they're not really holding on to it well. They're not manipulating it in any sort of intentional fashion. So that's by 8 weeks. And then you double that to about 4 months. And this is when socially babies start to try more to get your attention. So they'll smile when they see you. They're not like smiling because you smiled or you did something to make them smile. They'll smile simply because they see you. And they will kind of chuckle when you try to make them laugh. So it's not like a full belly laugh, but they'll make laughing noises. They will also try to keep your attention. They'll look at you, they'll move, they'll make sounds to try to get or keep your attention. Now, some of the sounds they're making are more like ooh, ah, kind of the cooing sounds. So they'll make sounds back to you when you're talking to them. Cognitively, well, they're recognizing some things. So they might open their mouth when they see a breast or a bottle. They might just kind of stare at their hands like fascinated, or at other objects that are interesting to them. Physically, they're holding their head up at 4 months without any support, when you're holding them. And if you put a toy in their hand, they'll hold it pretty well. Then they'll kind of swing their arm around and use that toy as a pugil stick to bash you in the face with it, but not on purpose. They're also bringing their own hands to their mouth pretty reliably and cramming whatever you put in their hand in their mouth as well. And then they can push up. So they can get on their elbows, like their forearms. If you have a particularly advanced kiddo, you can push up on his arms when he's on his tummy. He's not really doing a lot of crawling around yet. 6 months, that's when things start to go a little faster. So they seem to recognize familiar people at this point. They'll even like to look at themselves in a mirror and laugh quite a bit. They'll take turns making sounds with you, imitating a little bit. They'll blow raspberries, kind of stick out their tongue, and they'll make a lot of squealing noises that you can kind of recognize as being joy. So you'll see kind of emotion come out in some of their communications. Cognitively, they're now putting things really in their mouth and exploring them a lot. They're not just accidentally kind of getting them up to their mouth and sucking on them a little bit. They're really using their mouth to explore whatever object you put in their hands, and they're reaching and grabbing the toys or objects that they want. And this is more of an intentional thing, not like when you have your baby up near your head and they grab your hair or your beard or something and pull on it. This is intentional grabbing. And then they can start to do things like refuse food if they're not hungry. So they'll kind of close their lips and not let you put the bottle into their mouth. Movement wise, they're starting to roll back and forth now. So from their tummy to their back, which is the easiest thing to do, still hard to go from back to the tummy. And they can push up with straight arms pretty reliably when they're on their tummy. And then they're kind of leaning on their hands to support themselves when they're sitting. So, like if they lean to the right, they'll put out a hand and kind of hold themselves up so that they can reach and grab that object that they want. But they're still not really super mobile yet. A really advanced kiddo might be crawling around by 6 months, but it's usually 7 months and after that they really start to become more mobile. By 9 months, they start to have this kind of shyness they didn't have before. You might say stranger danger. They'll start to get clingy. They'll be a little bit fearful around strangers potentially. Their facial expressions will be a lot more recognizable. So you could tell if they're happy or sad or angry or surprised, and they'll recognize their name. So if you call their name, they'll look at you. And then this is when they start to react when their attached adult leaves the room. So they'll look for them, they'll reach for them, they'll cry for them. I'm going to go into attachment in another episode, so we can go into that in a lot more detail. And then in 9 months, they're really into like peekaboo. They're really good at it. So here's when they really start making a lot of sounds that sound like ma 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 ma, or ba or pa pa. And they'll start to request to be picked up. They'll make motions if they want things. So they don't have a lot of words to speak with, but they might actually do something to communicate with you. Cognitively, they're now looking for something if you put it out of sight. So like if something drops, they have some sort of object permanence here where they can be like, where is that thing? I know it exists. I'm going to try to find it, like a spoon or a toy. And then they're going to be like using two hands together, not with a lot of dexterity, but like banging stuff together and things like that. They'll be able to set themselves up all by themselves, and they may be crawling around. They'll be moving things from one hand to the other, so they can do a little handoff. That's actually a pretty hard skill. So by 9 months, they can do that pretty reliably, usually. And then they can kind of use their fingers, like if you put foods down for them, they can sort of, they don't really grab it like with their fingers. They're not really dexterous like that yet, but they'll kind of rake it towards themselves at 9 months. Um, and they'll be able to do this while they're sitting up without any support. Now, by 12 months, they're becoming a lot more interactive. Now they're not just doing peekaboo, but they're doing pat a cake. They have a lot of the nonverbal stuff, so they'll wave goodbye, reach and grab and point and grunt, like, things like that. They'll call for mama, they'll call for daddy. They This is when they really have figured out the word no, and because they'd be into lots of things, they're probably crawling around. They might be pulling themselves up and walking a little bit. Some kids walk a little earlier than others, but by 12 months, just expect them to be pulling themselves up, holding on to furniture, kind of maybe taking a step or two, but not very reliably walking. They can also do stuff like put something into a container. So they have this kind of idea that something can go into something else. If you hide toys, they'll really go and find them by this point. They should have a really strong sense of like object permanence and that that toy is not disappeared or just kind of like, where is it? I don't know. If they see you put it under the blanket, they'll go to the blanket and pick it up. Now, by 15 months, uh, they're really more interactive and they're interactive with other children, other adults. They'll be walking around, grabbing toys out of containers, maybe even mimicking other children. They'll show you things that they think is cool, that they think are cool, and then like when they get excited, they'll start to like clap their hands and scream a little bit. You'll see them kind of social playing is starting around this time, where they will use a doll, they'll hug a doll or other toys, kind of showing affection a lot more. They're into cuddling. They'll even kiss you sometimes. As far as language is concerned, they've mastered mama and dada, but they also are able to do like syllables of other things. Like for ball, they might be like ba, or for dog, they might be like da, or they might know someone's name a little bit and use a syllable for the name for that person. If you name an object to them receptively, they can identify it. So you can say like ball, and they'll look at the ball if the ball is close by potentially. They'll also follow some directions, so you could reach out to them with your hand. They'll infer that you want them to give you whatever it is they have, so they could place it in your hand. Or you could even say, give me the toy, and they might respond by giving you the toy. Or they might also respond by like pulling it toward them, which would be like not gonna happen. And then if they need something, here's where they should be pointing. They should be pointing around and at things so that they can draw your attention to that thing, especially when they want something and they want the help getting it. Cognitively, they're starting to figure out that different things have different purposes. So they try to use, like, if they have a phone, a toy phone, they're going to pretend to play the phone. They're going to put stuff in a cup because stuff goes in a cup. They will open a book and start to like turn pages. They might even pretend to read a little bit, make sounds or something when they open the book. And they can start to stack things like some blocks. So they should have at least 2 blocks stacked up, and then they can go from there. By 15 months, if they're not completely walking, they should at least be taking a few steps on their own. If they're not taking a few steps by 15 months, then they're pretty well behind. And now they have dexterous fingers. So if you give them food, they're not just kind of scraping it to themselves like a backhoe. They're actually using their fingers to feed themselves. So they'll grab things, even particular things, and be able to put them in their mouth one at a time. By 18 months, they're really very socially aware, and unless, of course, they're not. But normally they would be pretty socially aware. They'll kind of move away from whoever their caregiver is, whoever their primary attachment figure is. But they'll keep an eye on them to be like, are they close by? They don't go too far by themselves, but they'll start to wander off a little bit. They're really like communicating a lot, like pointing at things all the time, showing you cool stuff that they think is really awesome. They'll be a lot more interested in pages of books that you have, and you can help them get dressed. They'll really participate more in the dressing, like pushing their arm through the sleeve or lifting up their foot, but they're probably not dressing themselves yet. They will try to say more words than just mama or dada, so they might be like truck, dog, little easy to say words. They'll have a few of those. And then when you ask them to do something like give it to me, you don't have to put out your hand and give them a gesture kind of to reinforce what you're saying. They will give it to you simply because you asked. Now they're also starting to copy more of what you're doing. So if you're washing the dishes, they might be pretending to wash the dishes. If you're sweeping the floor, they might pretend to sweep the floor. They'll be pushing toy cars around and things like that. At 18 months, they will also be walking around without anyone helping them or holding on to anything. They'll be able to like grab a crayon or a pencil and scribble on a piece of paper. They're probably not drawing shapes yet. If they are, you got yourself a pretty advanced kid. At 18 months, they'll also, you know, with some trepidation, be able to drink from a cup that doesn't have like a sippy thing on it. But yeah, don't do that over your nice carpet or in the car. And now they're really feeding themselves pretty reliably with their fingers and trying to use utensils like a spoon or a fork. But when using a fork, they're really using it more like a shovel. And they're climbing. Now they're really off to the races. So they're going to be getting up on the couch or on a chair and then onto the counter. So you got to be really careful by about 18 months because they'll be starting to get into everything now and stuff you didn't think that they could do before. By about 2 years of age, they really start to notice things like when other people are hurt or upset, and they'll pause, they'll kind of assess the situation. They might even look sad when someone else is sad. They might look at you and kind of to see how are you reacting in this situation and try to figure out how they're going to react based on that. When you're reading to them now, you can ask them things like, "Where's the bear?" or "Where's the ball?" or "Which is the cat?" And they'll say two words together pretty frequently. They're like, "Want more?" And then they'll point to maybe some parts of their body too. So you can ask them like, "Where's your nose?" And they can touch their nose. At 2 years, they'll be like coming up to you if they want you to see something, and they'll hold it out to you and be like babble a little bit. You might understand a couple of the words, but not quite all of them. They might say your name or something like that. Try to get your attention, and you can kind of have these conversations with them where you don't know what they're saying, and I'm not sure they know what you're saying, but they're just kind of having a conversation. So around 2 years, cognitively, they'll be able to figure some things out that they couldn't figure out before. Like, for example, how to take a lid off of a container and how to like turn things, use knobs to open things, press buttons on the toys, things like that. Things that before were kind of difficult, they'll start to figure out a little bit more. And then they might actually use multiple toys at the same time instead of just like having one. And then this is where they start to really kind of do a little pretend play where they use some of the toys appropriately to do things like they might play with a doll, set it down at a table or something like that, put food on a plate, things like that. And then when they're about 2 years old, they'll start clumsily kicking a ball. But at this point, they'll be able to run around. They kind of look like, a little penguin or something, but they're still able to run pretty good. And then they'll be able to climb up some stairs. Depending on the stairs, they might need to hold a rail or something, but they'll be able to get upstairs without actually having to crawl. And at this point, they're pretty good at eating with utensils. So they'll get most of it in their mouth unless they want to play with it. And then it gets wherever, they're still like putting the plate above their head and throwing it off their tray. or stuff like that. But they can, if they want to, eat with a spoon. Now, about 6 months to a year later, they really start doing a lot of other things. I'm talking here about 30 months to about 3 years of age. They'll play next to other children a lot and then sometimes even join in with them. And then by the time they're about 3 years old, they'll actually see other kids playing and then run up to them and start playing with them. They'll kind of have an idea as to what the game is, or at least they want to be included. They'll really want a lot of attention, say, look at me, look at what I'm doing. And if you leave them by about 3 years old, they'll calm down pretty fast. Within about 5 to 10 minutes, instead of like the hour they screamed when you dropped them off the daycare the first few times when they were 2 years old. They'll also start talking more. So between about 30 months and 3 years, they'll have 50 plus words in their vocabulary, and they'll start saying a lot more, things together. They'll even actually have some questions, short sentences like, what's this? Um, they'll say things like I, me, or we, so they can use personal pronouns, and they'll do a lot more pretend play. They'll have real kind of conversations, asking a lot of questions, even a lot of why questions, where questions, things like that. And by the time they're three, they'll start to tell you what's in the book. So they'll say what's going on when you have a book open, and they'll even pretend to read it with you and follow to maybe 3-step commands, but doing pretty good for 2-step commands. So around 3 years, so this is probably something very testable. They can start drawing a circle instead of just scribbling. They also can be taught things like don't touch hot, and then they'll approach something with a little trepidation. You can tell them ahead of time something is dangerous, and they should be able to adjust their behavior a little bit. And as far as like by the time they're three, they're making those macaroni necklaces and other things. They're not uh, making masterpieces, but they can put something on a string. They can glue something to a piece of paper. They can even maybe put on some of the clothes by themselves, as long as they're not like super tight fitting or something like that. So if you give them some loose pants or a jacket, they can get it on. Um, and now instead of just like using all utensils kind of like a spoon, they're able to, use the fork more like a fork, where they can stick it in something and hold something down or put it in their mouth. So by 3 years, they're joining other kids when they're playing. They're asking you tons of questions. They're drawing circles. They're kind of running around excited about the world. They make macaroni necklaces, and they can use a fork. And then by 4 years, their pretend play gets to be a lot better. So socially, they're kind of able to identify roles, and they can put themselves in that role, like they're the teacher, or they might act like a dog. They'll start knowing that they can go and play with other kids. So they'll ask for things like that. They'll start to really respond to other people when they're hurt or they need comfort. They might give somebody a hug. They might go over and be like, it's okay. They also are very danger averse. So if, heights, they've figured that out. Well, hopefully, if they don't have ADHD, they're more danger averse. Um, and cautious when they're doing things like climbing up high. They'll also want to assist you in things that you're doing. So they kind of want to be the helper. They want to be included in stuff. And they can really adjust their behavior based on the situation. So, if you take them to a place where they're supposed to be quiet, like a museum or like church or a library or something, they can whisper and stuff. Um, but if you bring them to a playground, they know that it's okay to get all crazy on the playground. And now they're saying some sentences, and the sentences may have 4 or more words in them. They'll start to quote things from the stories they hear. They'll start to quote songs. They'll start to quote rhymes or poems that they've heard. They'll start to quote you when you say things you don't want them to be quoting back. Um, and they'll really be able to kind of figure out how to say something pretty quick and imitate someone else's speech. At 4 years old, they'll be able to tell you a little, autobiographical information about themselves. They'll be able to tell you what happened that day, answer simple questions about what things are used for. So, cognitively and communication wise, they're able to kind of demonstrate skills with the world. They can name some colored items. If there's a story they've heard over and over again, they can pretty much tell that to you. And they can draw more complex objects. So not just a circle, but they might be able to put a circle and a line and some arms and a leg or certain stuff like that. They might even be able to make like a triangle or a square if they're doing really well. So at age 4, while they're probably not buttoning up like a collared shirt, they might be able to unbutton some of the buttons. They might be able to pour their own water in their glass and get most of it in there most of the time. And then here's where they really can start holding a pencil between their like finger and thumb instead of just kind of like fisting it. They've got a lot more dexterity. Then come around 5 years, and this is going to be the place where I stop because after 5, kids kind of enter this period where, they've kind of basically gotten everything that adults can do but just not doing it as well as adults can do. So by the time they're 5, they'll be able to follow rules and stuff, take turns, and play more complex games. They'll be able to sing, dance, act things out. You might be able to give them simple chores like helping pick up stuff. They might actually enjoy being put in a position of authority where they help the younger kids learn how to do stuff. Um, you can get them to like help with laundry and clearing the table and things like that. They'll be able to tell you a story that they actually made up. They not one that they just heard. They'll answer simple questions about a book or a story after you read it to them, so you can read it to them and say, "Hey, what happened?" And there'll be whatever parts of the story that they were interested in. They can narrate back to you, and they can actually kind of keep up a conversation. So it's not just like, one or two exchanges and then I'm done. We're talking, you know, a good back and forth here. And then they'll start to get interested in the way language works and stuff, especially things like rhyming. So if you get Dr. Seuss out when they're 5 years old, they're going to really get a kick out of that. And by 5, they're also counting. They're counting up to 10, which is actually pretty good. And, so they've made it to the base 10. And I don't know, some adults can barely do more than that. Um, they can name some of the numbers and letters when you point at them. If you've practiced it, you can say, "Hey, what's this?" And they can say, "Oh, that's a B," or "That's a 5," or something like that. And then they understand time pretty well. So at least like something happened in the past, something happened in the very recent past, and then something is going to happen soon or a long time from now. Most of them kind of get that general concept of time. And they can also pay attention for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. They might enjoy things like story time. And they could even write their name down. I mean, if you teach them, and you practice with them, a 5-year-old could do that. And they could name some of the letters. I mean, if you were like a really insistent parent, you could probably get them to learn all of them. But you'd have to work pretty hard, probably. And here's the point where they really can start to button some of the buttons. So if you don't give them those small buttons with those tiny little holes, um, they'll be able to actually manage it. I in my opinion, putting buttons on little kids' clothes is just kind of cruel. But yeah, it's still done for style reasons. And they're much more, physically dexterous. They're walking pretty good. they're dancing, they're climbing, they're doing all those things, and they're doing them in a way that's actually rather sophisticated. And they can even do stuff like hopping on one foot. If you teach them how to balance, they can balance. Their athletic abilities are basically where they need to be to start learning how to do more complex movements. So I'm going to stop there. Actually, this went way longer than I thought it would. I thought to get to 5 years old would take me like 15 minutes, but it's been 35 minutes. Um, and so I just want to kind of go through real quick and summarize. By about 2 months, that's when they're kind of starting to interact with you, right? Just a little bit, but before that, there's not much going on. And then by 4 months, they're really wanting to kind of interact, and they're doing things. They're making a few sounds. They might, be responding to the environment in a way that's kind of predictive, like uh, if they see a bottle or something, they might open their mouth, and movement wise, they can hold up their head. Then by about 9 months, this is when they start to recognize someone as unrecognized. Say this, so they're like the familiar people they can separate out from the non-familiar people, and they have a lot more social expressions. They start to look for things when they're out of sight, so they have this kind of object permanence starting to develop. And then by a year old, that's pretty, locked in. They're pulling themselves up to stand. If they're pretty advanced, they're walking by that time. They're using the words mama and dada. And then by two, they're, stringing words together like two words. They're answering simple questions. They can point to things like if you ask where they are, they can show you stuff. They're socially aware of other people's emotions. They'll notice that. They'll look at parents by the time they're 2 years old to be like, see how they're reacting to a situation to kind of judge what they should be doing. They can hold stuff in like both hands and do things and kick balls and run around. And then by 3 years old, here they're finally doing things like drawing circles. They're more easy to calm when they're separated from the parents. They're really curious, who, what, where, why, how, where's mommy, what's happening. And then they can identify what's going on around them. And then by three, they're that's the macaroni necklace time. Like I can use my fingers to actually put stuff on a string, kind of dexterity. By four, they're just getting a lot more of that. By four, they're pretend playing a lot more. They are pretending to be other things. They're using toys in a way that shows that they're, acting like that toy is being used for something else. They're understanding simple questions that are not just like where, but like what is it for, and they can tell you like what something is used for, things like that. So by the time they're four, they might be able to draw a person like a kind of a stick person or like a ovally person where you have a circle for the head and some ovals for body parts. And they're catching a ball, a big ball. They're not catching golf balls or ping pong balls, but you throw them a big ball and they can kind of use both hands to catch it. But by five, they might actually be able to catch a small ball, hop on one foot, button some of their buttons, count to 10 at least. They're singing and dancing. I mean, they're helping clear the table. They're having conversations with you. By five, they're basically little bitty humans that can do most of the things that we consider adults do, but just not so much. So why is all this important? Well, I'm in the near future episodes I'm going to be talking about a lot of child development stuff like Piaget and Erikson and Freud's psychosexual development and Anna Freud and attachment and temperament and a lot of things that really depend on what the kid can do and when they can do it. And so these different social emotional milestones, their language and communication milestones, these cognitive milestones, and these physical kind of movement milestones are very important for determining what a kid can do when. And then there's all these social factors, these psychosocial factors that go into it as well. So this is the basics. These developmental milestones are like the basics of what they can do, if they're in an environment that encourages them to do these things. Next, we're going to talk about people's explanations for things like why they do these things and what are some of the maybe dilemmas that they face during these times, and whether or not they're competing for their mother's affection with their father, or they are trying to develop some sort of trust versus distrust, or they are expressing their anxiety through some kind of pretend play, or they're repressing their anger at their mother for abandoning them by going to work. So we're going to start doing some of the deep stuff next, because I'm pretty sure that's going to be on the test. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Sidactic Caps Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.